The nation's largest LGBTQ plus civil rights organization, the Human Rights Campaign, has been at the forefront of the fight to end discrimination against LGBT communities for a very long time. From fighting for marriage equality to promoting change through elections, the organization has been very effective at using social media to communicate with its 3 million supporters and many, many more. My next guest is Alphonso David, president of the Human Rights Campaign. He's the first civil rights lawyer, the first black man and first person of color to serve as president of HRC in the organization's 40-year history. Alphonso, thanks so much for joining us. It's good to see you again. I look forward to the time we can, hang out in person. But let me just ask you, what's there's kind of a scale, right? We have the Supreme Court decision, but before that, just weeks before that, we saw the president saying, hey, adoption centers don't have to make adoptions available to gay or lesbian parents. We saw a real erosion in health benefits. And I sort of feel like we're in this weird moment of progress and collapse. Maybe it's always like that. But what's your dashboard tell you about the state of civil rights in America right now?
Well, first, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. The LGBTQ movement, as you know, and as you noted, has achieved really significant success over the past several years. If you go back only a few years ago, same-sex intimate conduct was decriminalized. Only a few years ago, we received a significant win from the Supreme Court with marriage equality. And we reaffirmed protections for LGBTQ people under federal civil rights laws as recently as a week and a half ago. So there has been dramatic, significant changes. But within the current context that we live in, with an administration that has sought to erase LGBTQ people, those successes are great in a vacuum. But LGBTQ people, unfortunately, are still living under oppressive policies all over this country. In 29 states in this country, LGBTQ people do not have comprehensive legal protections. We recently won those protections in Virginia, as you may know. We fought in Virginia to elect a pro-equality legislature for the very first time in the history of Virginia. We won 7 out of the 8 priority districts that the Human Rights Campaign identified. And then we worked with those elected officials to pass the most comprehensive LGBTQ non-discrimination bill. It is the first in the South. But that is not the case in 29 states in this country, where people run the risk of being denied services, being denied housing, and other basic necessities. So we need the Equality Act to make sure that we can provide comprehensive protections to LGBTQ people. The successes we have had, the ones last week, not only with respect to DACA, but also with respect to Title VII, were great successes coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court. But I'm looking at a larger landscape where LGBTQ people, unfortunately, are not protected, where we're seeing people being attacked, the high rates of violence against the transgender community. There's a lack of protection in many of our towns and our cities and our states. And we need to do a lot more work to make sure there's comprehensive protections.
Let me ask you a complex question, and it's not entirely my question, but it's an observation out there, because I'm going to have a discussion in a little while with someone who says that the lesbian and gay community has had its eyes shut to transgendered women in particular, but transgendered people, particularly transgendered people of color, and that the progress made on one side of the LGBTQ plus equation hasn't been shared. And I mean, you have a responsibility to kind of look at the broad human rights, across the board. Is there a problem inside the LGBTQ community in understanding that if there is a deficit in rights for one part of that equation, that there's a fragility for all?
Short answer is yes. Historically, there has been a failure to appreciate members of the transgender community. We don't have to go that far back to see that there was a lack of appreciation of the transgender community. We've seen it in legislation, we've seen it in social circles, we've seen it in so many different contexts. So I think that conclusion is absolutely correct, that many members of the LGB community were not that supportive of the transgender community, and that is changing. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're not there yet. And just a fact is that since 2013, I believe, since the Human Rights Campaign has been tracking violence against members in the trans community, more than at least 178 transgender people have been killed. 178 transgender people have been killed in this country since 2013. Last year, we had at least 27. This year, at least 16. I say at least because those are the people who we know of. There are instances where we don't know that people are being attacked, people are being killed in this country. And unfortunately, I think the larger community did not spend sufficient time, resources, and place attention on issues that are affecting members of our trans community. So again, I think things are changing, but that is unfortunately emblematic of, I think, other movements. And I think if you look at the larger societal culture, where we've been talking about equality and justice for all, and unfortunately we've left our immigrant siblings outside in the cold. We've left Black and brown people generally outside in the cold. And we constantly talk about dignity under the law, and we talk about equality under the law. But in fact, there's so many members of our community that have been left out. So I think within the community, we still have a lot of work to do. I think in the context of larger society, we have a lot of work to do.
The other thing that has struck me after going to a lot of HRC dinners over the years is that you've got an extraordinary network, particularly, just across regular people, regular individuals, but big corporations, media folks. You're like, it's Wizard of Oz. You're the wizard in this. But that said, some of it seems that network seems unsubstantial and fake to me. And let me tell you what I'm trying to say here. For instance, not last time I saw you, but we ran into each other at the World Economic Forum in Davos last January. And when you look at the companies up there, you look at the World Economic Forum, it kind of pretends to be gay-friendly, but there's not much programming up there, right? You've got folks like Beth Brooke, who are at EY, and Microsoft's Brad Smith, who have been trying to push the World Economic Forum to be genuinely inclusive of the LGBTQ community, but they weren't there. And so I'm interested in how you translate this power network you have of these companies where they support the dinners and they may have staff there, but yet when you come to power circles, they're still a little bit cautious of topics that deal with this subject right now. And maybe I'm wrong. I want to give you an opportunity to tell me I'm wrong, but I would love to hear how you're going to move them from the casually interested box into meaningful participation in LGBTQ rights.
No, I don't think you're wrong, but I think there are two different conversations we're having about this issue. One is corporate support of LGBTQ issues within the United States, and then corporate support of LGBTQ issues outside of the United States. And it all comes down to value. How do you define value? And how do you define your corporate culture? There's one thing to say that I support LGBTQ people. There's another to open up a satellite office in a country where an LGBTQ person could be killed just simply being who they are. And that is the conversation that I'm forcing us to have as a community, not only within corporate communities, but also within the larger context. Companies often talk about their values, and I want to make sure that those values are translating into action. And many companies have been incredibly supportive of the Human Rights Campaign and the LGBTQ civil rights movement. All we have to do is look back in the 1980s when the Reagan administration wouldn't recognize the LGBTQ community or say the word HIV or AIDS. And the corporate community were the ones who actually supported the LGBTQ community. Not all corporations have been supportive, certainly, but we have had a substantial amount of support. But that support has to now translate into other things, and I mean action. Submitting an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in support of LGBTQ issues, making sure that you are not opening up satellite offices in countries where we can be killed for simply being who we are, and instead engaging in advocacy with us to make sure we transform that landscape, supporting so much of the programmatic work that we have to do. Many companies do, not enough of them do. So I think when I really explore the issues of corporate support of LGBTQ equality, I see a lot of successes, but I see so much work that has to be done. And at its core for me is how do we define values and how do we define corporate social responsibility?
One of the other things that I've enjoyed over the years from HRC is they have and I'm going to can get it wrong, but a sort of cities index, like the great cities when it comes to LGBTQ inclusion. And they have those that are the laggards on the list, that are way down there. And so you can't name New York or San Francisco, but what are the characteristics of maybe 2 or 3 of the top cities that get it right? And let's put a spotlight on those that don't yet.
Sure. So we have a number of indexes that look at LGBTQ equality. We have the Corporate Equality Index, and we look to see whether or not companies have inclusive policies. We have the Healthcare Index, and we're looking at healthcare facilities and hospitals, nursing homes, to determine whether or not they have appropriate policies that respect LGBTQ people. And what you're mentioning is the Municipal Equality Index.
Yes.
And that is looking at localities to determine whether or not they have inclusive policies. Do you have a non-discrimination policy that includes gender identity? Do you have policies that would hold employers accountable if you contract with them? And we have a laundry list of criteria where we look to make sure that municipalities are really evaluating their policies through an inclusive lens. Are they recognizing restrooms consistent with a person's gender identity or not? You have instances where there are some municipalities that have very supportive laws with respect to LGB people, but not transgender people. From my perspective, those municipalities wouldn't rank 100 on the score on the index because it's not inclusive. Our community is LGBTQ, and we need to make sure that it's inclusive. And it's going to grow because many people have been talking about LGBTQ plus and what that means to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible. There are instances where gender nonconforming people may not be appropriately recognized in certain municipalities. We need to make sure that that is not the case. We need to make sure that when we think about diversity, we think about diversity from a very broad landscape. It's not simply through the lens of race and ethnicity. We're also looking at sexual orientation and gender identity. So those are a few factors that we look at to determine whether or not municipalities are really meeting the grade and having an inclusive environment. And if you think about this from a practical perspective, you have someone working for a large company. They decide to transfer that person to another city or another state. We need to make sure that those protections exist and travel with that employee. So that's not only important with respect to the Corporate Equality Index, but it's also incredibly important for the Municipal Equality Index, because some employees may lose protection simply by transferring to another city, another state, another town, and we can't have our civil rights be subject to the state lines in which we live.
Right. So I want to ask you a question before I go to, we've got a question lined up for you, but I want to ask you something on the personal side. You're a person of color, you're the first, black lawyer, person of color to head this. And, people looking and say, oh, Alphonso, he's made it. He's the superstar, he's got it. I'd like, I think when we've talked with people today, I'd love you to share with people where the points of trouble were for you. What did you have to overcome? Because we all have those, but we don't often share them. So I'd love to hear what, because you're an inspiration to many other people who'd like to try and achieve something along the lines of what you're doing. But where have you had tough times?
I have them today. So as a black man, thinking about how I exercise and where I exercise sometimes becomes a very difficult deliberative exercise process for me. As you know, as being the head of the Human Rights Campaign, I travel the country, or prior to COVID-19, I traveled the country. And there are instances where I thought, it's 8 p.m. at night, I probably shouldn't go running in this town. I shouldn't go running outside because there's a risk that I'm going to have to defend myself. There's a risk that I might be attacked simply because of being LGBTQ. So as much as we achieve as people of color, that success is completely irrelevant with respect to issues of police brutality, discrimination, and indifference. And so I see that and unfortunately still have to grapple with that in my daily life. With respect to some of the challenges that I've overcome, I've certainly been, I've overcome a number of challenges. One is specifically in college. And I remember being in a class, it was an English class, and we were told to write a paper. And I decided that I was going to write a paper about Charles Manson because I thought he was just a bizarre character, and I really wanted to understand why he was so influential with such a small group of people. And another friend of mine decided he was going to write a paper on Martin Luther King, and the professor made an assumption that, and we submitted our papers based on letters, like numbers. We didn't identify our names on the papers. And the professor came back and handed the papers back, assumed that I wrote the Martin Luther King paper, and assumed that my friend wrote the Charles Manson paper, gave me a C minus and gave him an A plus. And I realized after the fact, when we confronted him, that no, I wrote the Charles Manson paper. My friend wrote the Martin Luther King paper. And there's so much implicit bias that is inherent and built into our systems, education systems, business systems, not-for-profit systems, that we have to deconstruct them. Because the powers that be, in many cases, make unwarranted assumptions about who we are and what our capacities are. And unfortunately, that in many cases affects people of color. So that's just an example of one of the challenges that I had to overcome, is the assumption that you're not as smart, you're not as capable, you don't have as much capacity as others may have.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to ask you one more question before I go to our question. You know, with George Floyd's murder, I'm very cognizant that this studio right now is literally half a block from Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. at 16th and K Street, for those of you nearby. It's very powerful to see that, to see the people who are going down there and inspired. And George Floyd's murder and the protests are obviously, you know, there's some kind of inflection point in this country. But for a while, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but let's just say that the level of mutual support between America's Black community and America's LGBT community may not be where it should have been. Is this an opportunity for greater bridge building between those communities than we've had in the past?
Yes, this is an opportunity for us to build more bridges with organizations, coalitions that are specifically focused on people of color. And I've been doing that since I joined the organization. We are a part of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which includes, I think, more than 200 organizations. And using that coalition to really build additional alliances with other organizations, and really think about our equality as not being something that we will achieve through a myopic lens. I think this is an opportunity for us to see that LGBTQ equality is directly and inextricably linked with the equality for people of color and other marginalized communities. What I mean by that is, if I am free as a gay man, but I'm not free as a Black man, I am really not free. And for a very long time, I think we have disregarded identities, multiply marginalized identities that people bring to the table. And this is an opportunity for us to really take a step back and reflect on what that means and how we change that as a matter of policy, but also how we change that with respect to how we act and who we interact with and what our social circles look like. This is an opportunity for us to really branch out. And if you consider yourself to be a progressive person, but you don't know a single trans person or a single LGBT or LGB person or a Black person, that actually affects how you think about social issues, how you think about policy, and whether or not we are approaching this through an integrated intersectional lens.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you. I really appreciate your perspective and your leadership at HRC. So we have a question now from Jackie. Jackie, please.
Hello there. My name is Jackie Lois, and I'm excited to participate in today's summit. I am a member of a Metropolitan Community Church of Washington, D.C., and I was hoping to hear from any of the members of the panel to discuss the role of faith communities, churches, temples, religious organizations in promoting civil rights. As I reflect on the civil rights movement, the church was key. Many denominations got together and decided that not only moral outrage, but also support for the community was a key part of building coalitions. So thank you for your thoughts.
Alphonso.
Well, I think the faith community is a huge part of our strategy in achieving equality for LGBTQ people. I recently relaunched a program at the Human Rights Campaign, a religion and faith program that focuses on creating alliances with members in the faith community. Before COVID-19, I had announced a nationwide tour to visit churches and mosques and synagogues and other religious institutions to really identify ways in which we can work together with members in the faith community. And there's an assumption often made that if you're an LGBTQ person, you can't also be a person of faith, which is just a flawed narrative. It's not true. There are many people who are people of faith, but also happen to be LGBTQ, and many who are actually actively participating in their churches, their synagogues, their mosques, and other religious institutions. So our quest for equality has to be integrated with people of faith who will be incredibly helpful. And as you think about scripture, and I was raised Methodist and Baptist, and I think about the Bible, but I know that this is reflected in other religious texts. God loves us unconditionally. And that principle of God loving us unconditionally should also be a principle that we adapt or adopt as we interface with other people. How is it that God can love me unconditionally, but you can't because of my sexual orientation or my gender identity or my race or my immigration status? And the list goes on. So there are members in the faith community that we have to engage with that may not be supportive of LGBTQ rights, but I am willing to have those conversations because I think opposing me for being who I am is really not reflective of the scripture that I know. And I think if we don't have those conversations, it will be a lost opportunity. And at the Human Rights Campaign, we are having those conversations.
Well said, and thanks for the great question, Jackie. Alphonso David, President of the Human Rights Campaign, thank you so much for your time today and your leadership, and happy Pride, and keep up the great work. So thank you so much for joining us.